Good evening, all. My name is Janine Titus, and I'm your presenter today. I just want to thank everyone for who's able to join this evening. I just want to thank you again. We have a presenter today. Her name is Erica Washington. She's an MSW graduate of the University of Arlington School of Social Work. She is currently an ASW certified as she completes her hours to obtain the LSCW. She began her career in social work in the area of child welfare with the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services from 2014 to 2016. Since receiving her master's degree as a social worker, Erica has dedicated her service to improving outcomes for persons living with HIV. She currently serves as a program manager of AIDS Healthcare Foundation for the San Bernardino and Riverside counties in Southern California. In this role, she has been recognized for her success in implementing successful interventions to increase rates for viral load suppression. She serves on the national leadership team for the ECHO collaboration, a national initiative to end health disparities in the Ryan White community. She has been awarded by the Health Resource Administration and Center for Quality Improvement and Innovation for her state and statewide leadership of the California Regional Group for Ryan White Improvement and her junior research effort to improve health outcomes for persons living with HIV. Erica also serves as an HIV community support group facilitator for the True Evolution and AIDS Healthcare Foundation. In this capacity, she has the opportunity to provide community outreach, health education, and mental health support to several disparity populations throughout the Inland Empire. I just want to thank Erica for being here tonight. And let's just start off with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for allowing us this opportunity to be here to listen to some very important information. I thank you for allowing us to come together in this time of separation. And dear Lord, just help that this message tonight reach someone in need. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Erica, it's
Thank you
on
so
you.
much, Janine, for that kind introduction. And I also want to say thank you to Pastor Morris and the Kansas Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church for allowing me the opportunity to bring this community awareness regarding HIV. Today, my presentation is going to be about HIV 101, and we're also going to give honor to World AIDS Day, and I'll explain what World AIDS Day is all about in just a few moments. My name is Erica Washington. Again, I am a Master of Social Work, seeking my licensed clinical social work degree to enhance the work that I do in the community of HIV and for persons living with HIV and AIDS. To reflect on World AIDS Day, which just passed on December 1st, 2020, I'd like to share a little bit of information about what World AIDS Day is and what it means to the community of people who are affected by HIV. World AIDS Day was first recognized on December 1st, 1988. Um, the purpose of the day is to bring attention to the HIV epidemic, which is still to this day an epidemic, to increase awareness, to bring education and awareness to communities so that we can decrease stigma and increase our response to the epidemic. and also to stand up against stigma. And the way that we do that is by what we're doing today, which is educating people and breaking down barriers between the communities and persons who are affected by HIV. World AIDS Day also challenges us to uphold our commitment to ending the epidemic and increasing access to treatment. Today, while there have been very many advancements in access to treatment and treatments in general, there are still many, many people in the world who don't have access to treatment and who are dying from HIV and AIDS. This year, we want to honor the resilience of people living with HIV and AIDS. Also, we want to honor the resilience of healthcare workers, people who live with HIV, and especially those who are long-time survivors, people who have been surviving 10 years, 20 years, 30 years with HIV have had to be resilient in order to survive up until this day. There was a time when medications were not as advanced as they were today, and they were very difficult to remain in treatment, up to 10, 15 pills a day sometimes in order for people to survive. And that took resilience. It took resilience and faith that as time passed, things would get better. Also, resilience to fight the stigma. We'll talk a little bit more about stigma later, but a HIV diagnosis comes with a whole heap of stigma regarding people having fear and false beliefs about what HIV is and how it can be transmitted. And it takes resilience to live through that and fight through that every single day. Healthcare workers have to be resilient as well, to know that their work is important and that no matter how challenging it may be to see clients and patients going through the struggle with HIV and AIDS, that the fight is worth it every single day. Communities and healthcare systems have to continue to fight to end the HIV epidemic in the midst of a global pandemic. The coronavirus, COVID 19, has come upon us during a time where there were already other epidemics and things that we had to fight. But we cannot let HIV go unnoticed or untalked about, or stop our awareness coming to HIV care and treatment because there's another pandemic. We have to balance these important issues equally and make sure that people are becoming aware of how to take care of themselves with HIV as well as with COVID 19 during this time. So, what is HIV? HIV is the human immunodeficiency virus. That is what HIV stands for. And HIV, like other viruses, is a microscopic infectious agent that cannot live or replicate outside of other cells. HIV chooses CD4 cells and other lymphocytes as its host. Lymphocytes are other white blood cells, as is CD4. And so, what the virus does is it attaches itself to the white blood cell, destroys it, and uses that white blood cell to replicate itself. AIDS is a medical diagnosis given when a person meets any of several conditions, one of being a CD4 count equal to or less than 200 per microliter. And we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between HIV and AIDS later on in this presentation. And we'll also discuss ways that HIV is transmitted. What does HIV do in the body? So, before the development of protease inhibitors and combination therapies, virtually all people with HIV infection eventually developed AIDS. AIDS is the advanced stage of an HIV infection. Therefore, a person with HIV or a person with an AIDS diagnosis both initially had an HIV diagnosis. So, protease inhibitors and combination therapies came later in the field of HIV. There was a time where we did not have these very advanced and effective medications. And so the infection was able to develop into AIDS over time. Now we have these wonderful drugs that people can take that will prevent the virus of HIV from developing into AIDS as long as the person is adherent to their medication and choose to live an overall healthy lifestyle. So, yes, we have newer and more advanced medications available so that people no longer have to take a handful of medication in order to stay healthy. Most people can take one pill a day, every day, and remain very healthy and have their HIV completely under control. And also not to be able to spread the virus to others. That is called reaching a state of undetectable. The virus becomes undetectable when a person is on their treatment. Thus, they cannot transmit the virus. HIV infects the body through several different cells of the immune system. As more of these cells become infected, fewer are able to fight off the disease. So, as HIV replicates in the body and is going untreated, it is depleting those white blood cells. Our white blood cells are our fighter cells, they fight to keep us healthy. And so, as more of these white blood cells become infected, they become weaker, they become fewer, then our body becomes less able to fight off diseases. Diseases that a healthy immune system can prevent become more dangerous, even life threatening, as they overpower the immune system of a person affected by HIV. So during this time, if a person is positive with HIV and they're going untreated and their HIV is becoming out of control, then the immune system is so weak that the body cannot handle trying to fight off an additional pathogen, and therefore that person becomes very vulnerable and even may die as a result of a illness that any other person might be able to fight off with no problem. So, how does the body respond to HIV? The body produces something called antibodies when a person becomes HIV positive. And antibodies are specialized proteins produced by the body's immune system in response to infection by viruses. Antibodies are used to detect HIV during testing. Antibodies also remove and destroy pathogens from the body. However, when a person is exposed to HIV, if they become HIV positive, it takes the body anywhere between 2 weeks and 6 months to develop enough antibodies for an HIV test to give an accurate diagnosis. So that's important to remember that when one is testing for HIV, they are not testing for actual HIV in the body. We are testing for antibodies to HIV in the body, which can take quite a while to develop. On average, it takes about 3 months for a person's body to produce enough antibodies to get an accurate HIV diagnosis. In rare cases, however, it can take between 6 months to a year, up to a year, for the body to produce enough of these antibodies in order to get an accurate positive read on an HIV test. So it's extremely important for us to understand that once there's been a possibility of an exposure, going to get an HIV test a month later, 2 months later, is not enough to rule out an actual HIV infection. There has to be a period of time, up to 6 months at least, of HIV testing in order to rule out a positive HIV diagnosis after a potential exposure. So there is something called the spectrum of HIV disease. And in this chart, we can see what happens between initial exposure to HIV and the advanced stage of HIV called AIDS. So we're going to start on the exposure end of the spectrum. There is no previous infection, there are no symptoms. One has been exposed to HIV through one of the modes of transmission, which could be sex, which could be mother to child during childbirth and delivery, or through breastfeeding. And also, an exposure could be through injection IV drugs. So there's an exposure that happens. And following the exposure, potentially will be an infection, which one is not fully aware of that infection until that window period is complete. And during that time, most people who get an initial infection immediately don't have any symptoms. They're still asymptomatic. So initial symptoms normally appear within a few weeks and last for a few weeks. Those symptoms range anywhere from fever to muscle ache to swollen glands and have the tendency to mimic a mild flu. After those few weeks, there could be a period of 8 to 11 years where an individual is completely symptomless. There is no other symptoms that they're HIV positive. And this is one of the reasons why many people go undiagnosed for a very long time and they don't know it. During that time, they are able to transfer the virus to other people because they don't have treatment. So it's very important if there's any potential exposure through any of the ways that I just spoke about: drug use, unprotected sex, or being born to a mother who is positive, that a person is tested regularly to know their HIV status. So the progression of HIV during this 8 to 11 years, the progression is dependent upon the individual person. HIV progresses in individuals at different rates. Some people may not see any illness in 11 years, while some may see illness very, very soon, feel weakness, feel tired, lose weight, and know that something's wrong. But it just depends. That's not guaranteed to indicate that there's an HIV infection. So when one begins to experience HIV illness, these are some of the symptoms that can indicate an HIV infection: night sweats, fevers, fatigue, diarrhea, swollen lips, swollen lymph nodes, oral and vaginal candidiasis, PID, pelvic inflammatory disease, Pap smear positive for HPV. Those are some of the indications that a person may need to check for HIV. And then the advanced stage of HIV is AIDS. That is normally when a person's white blood cell count, their CD4 cell count, has fallen below 200. And the HIV is depleting the immune system at a more rapid pace. A person may begin to experience wasting syndrome. That means that they're unable to maintain a healthy weight and start to lose that muscle mass that is necessary for us to support our bodies. They may also begin to experience HIV-related dementia. So those are some key symptoms and signs to look for along this HIV spectrum of disease. Hopefully, immediately after a potential exposure, a person will begin to check themselves and get tested through that window period up until 6 months. And if they are positive, are able to quickly identify that they are positive, identify the infection, and begin treatment. The earlier a person begins treatment for HIV, the better their life outcome will be in most cases. So now we'll talk about modes of transmission. And what I mean by modes of transmission is ways that HIV can be transmitted from one person to another person. And we'll also talk about the high-risk groups that are associated with the modes of transmission. So starting with high-risk groups, some of our populations of people who are more higher risk of contracting HIV include men who have sex with men, and that is because during anal sex there is more chance for a transmission to happen, especially if it's unprotected. Women and men in heterosexual relationships, because there is penetration. It may be vaginal or may be anal, but there is an opportunity for fluids to be exchanged and for HIV to be spread. Sex workers, injection drug users, those receiving injections with unsterilized needles. Generally, this happens in low resource environments. Individuals born to or breastfed by HIV positive mothers, and anyone receiving unscreened blood products or organs. This could be potentially through a blood transfusion or through a organ surgery in countries with inadequate screening processes. So, the four main modes of transmission for HIV would be unprotected sexual intercourse with the HIV positive person, whether it is homosexual sex or heterosexual sex, sharing of unsterilized injection needles, mother to child transmission, and bloodborne, typically through surgery or blood transfusion. So, how can one avoid contracting HIV? The only 100% method of avoiding a HIV diagnosis is abstinence from sex. There are also other protective measures that a person can take to give themselves additional protections against HIV. One of them is PrEP. It's short for pre-exposure prophylaxis. And we'll talk more about PrEP, but essentially it is a drug that can be taken in advance of sex with a person who is HIV positive so that the virus cannot seroconvert. There will be no transmission or conversion in their body. The other drug is PEP, that's post-exposure prophylaxis. And this drug is taken very quickly after a potential exposure. So it has to be taken almost immediately after sex, drug use, something like that. A person feels that they may have potentially been exposed. They want to go and take PEP as soon as possible because there is a time frame for which PEP is no longer effective. And the longer an individual waits, the less effective the PEP is going to be. Another protective measure a person can take is using needle exchange programs. If one is a IV drug user and they use needles to inject themselves, whether it be with drugs, street drugs, or medicinal drugs, treatments, therapies, there are some drugs that we take to live that have to be injected. And we want to make sure that we're using clean needles and not sharing needles with anyone else. So needle exchange programs will exchange dirty needles for clean needles, in most cases for free, and therefore reducing the risk of a transmission of HIV through a needle. Using additional lubrication, this is especially important for penetration during sexual intercourse. Using additional lubrication can help prevent tears in the skin through which bodily fluids can assist in the transmission of HIV. So that is a protective measure. Oral sex is a protective measure versus penetration. The risk of contracting HIV through oral sex is much lower, much lower than the risk of contracting HIV through penetrative sex. Knowing one's substance use limitations. This is important for more than one reason, because one may begin to lower their protective measures and inhibitions once they are inebriated or extremely high, and may accidentally share needles when they didn't mean to, may accidentally have unprotected sex when they did not intend to do that day, being under the influence of substances in a manner where one is no longer aware of what's going on could make them vulnerable to abuse situations where they may not know who, when, or where they had sex or used drugs. So knowing one's personal limitations or abstaining from substance use is a very protective measure to prevent situations from occurring that are out of a person's control. The use of condoms is a very effective way of preventing a HIV infection, and also communicating with sex partners. talking to your partner about their status, talking to a partner about how often they get tested, talking to partners about their sexual preferences and other people with whom they may be sleeping with is all good information to know before you decide to engage in sex with someone. It's better to talk about it before and get a good understanding and of who you're sleeping with and what type of risk you're taking before you engage in sex. So let's talk about the difference between PrEP and PEP. PEP and PrEP are both methods of preventing HIV disease and involve taking HIV medicines. When you take steps to protect yourself against a disease like HIV, it's called prophylaxis. PrEP and PEP are for people who do not have HIV but are at risk of getting it. So we'll talk about what each drug is called. PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. PEP stands for post-exposure prophylaxis. So when is PrEP taken? PrEP is taken before HIV exposure. PrEP is taken every day, just as a person who is positive would take their pills every single day. And it prevents the HIV infection because the body is already on the HIV medication. PEP, however, is taken after HIV exposure. It's taken in emergency situations. PEP must be taken within 72 hours or 3 days after a possible exposure. And while this is a wonderful resource to have available, PEP is not to be used as the one fix all prevention method of contracting HIV. So this drug is not designed for a person to have continuous exposures and continuously try to take PrEP to prevent a possible exposure. If there, is a situation where a person thinks that they may be continuously exposed to or likely exposed, then they want to take PrEP. PrEP is the medication to be taken every day. Who is it for? PrEP is for people who do not have HIV, but they have a sex partner with HIV, or they have sex with people whose HIV status is unknown, or they share injection drug equipment. So there are many situations where people who are HIV negative choose to have a relationship with a person who is HIV positive. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, especially when one partner is on their medication and the other partner is on PrEP. There's a very super extremely low, almost no risk of the person who is HIV negative contracting HIV. PEP, on the other hand, is also used for people who are HIV negative, but PEP is more for people who are having sex and really found out something at the last minute, maybe that they weren't aware of. Maybe they had sex with a random partner, just a random one time, met someone online, had sex with them when they didn't plan to, did not protect themselves, or they were the instance we talked about, inebriated or high, and got into a situation where they don't really know what happened, and they had sex with someone, and they want to make sure that they're protected. They don't know. They just don't know. And so that's an emergency. That's a situation where it's better to be safe than sorry, and to go ahead and take a protective measure to protect yourself. PEP can be very helpful. Having a needle stick at work or something else that comes up, and it is another thing that comes up unexpected. Nobody expects to have an accidental needle stick, especially those of us working in the healthcare field understand how this can happen to anyone at any time. PEP is a wonderful resource to have available, especially for those of us working in infectious disease. And also by sharing injection drug equipment and not anticipating doing so, maybe something that happened while a person was under the influence and they did it. They did it. It's not a typical practice for them, but they did it this one time and they want to protect themselves. They would take PEP. And then we talked about those times when someone may be taken advantage of against their will, a sexual assault. PEP is a great resource because they don't know what that person's status was. How effective are PrEP and PEP? So PrEP can reduce the risk of HIV infection from sex by more than 90% and can reduce the risk of HIV infection from injection drug use by more than 70%. PEP can prevent HIV infection when taken correctly, but is not always effective. It is important that a person starts PEP as soon as possible after an exposure to give it the best chance of working. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about HIV stigma. Stigma is the negative attitudes or beliefs that a person or even a group of people or a society of people have about another group of people. In this case, we're talking about HIV stigma. So this is negative attitudes or beliefs that people have about persons who are HIV positive. A part of stigma can be believing that only certain groups of people can get HIV. I've heard only gay people get HIV, which is absolutely not true. I've heard only people who are careless and risky contract HIV. Not true. You don't have to be careless or risky to contract HIV. HIV can have HIV diagnosis can happen to almost anyone. Making moral judgments about people who take steps to prevent HIV transmission. So stigma can be someone being made to feel bad about wanting to take PEP or PrEP. Stigma can also be a person making someone feel bad about wanting to use a condom during sex. Oh, maybe you have HIV since you want to use a condom. So making moral judgments about people who take steps to prevent themselves from having HIV sometimes affects the individual's ability to actually protect themselves. Part of stigma is also feeling that people deserve to get HIV because of their choices. So these ideas and beliefs really impact a person in a community affected by HIV in a negative way. And sometimes it can even cause a person to have self-stigma and start to not like themselves and start to believe these things about themselves when it's not true. So another area that's really closely related to stigma is discrimination. Discrimination can look like this: a healthcare professional refusing to provide care or services to a person living with HIV, refusing casual contact with someone living with HIV. I've seen this a lot where, family members who may be uneducated about HIV will, make someone use a certain dish and they don't want to use the same dishes as that person, or they don't want to sit on the toilet after that person, or they don't want to be too close or sleep on the same pillow as a person that's affected by HIV, when in reality, none of those ways are ways that HIV can even be transmitted. Socially isolating a member of the community because they are HIV positive. Don't want them in your class, or you don't want them on your team, or you don't want them in your social group because of their status. That is discrimination based on HIV. And HIV can also be in our language. So we have to be really careful that we don't use terms like HIVers or positives or any of those other derogatory terms that have been used in the past to describe people living with HIV. People just like everybody else. Other ways that I've seen or heard of stigma coming out is not wanting to rent to a person who is HIV positive. So that person having a really hard time securing a place to live. So the only way that we can reduce HIV stigma and stand up against HIV stigma is to talk about HIV, to educate the community on what HIV is, how it can be transmitted, and how it cannot be transmitted, so that people don't have these unnecessary fears around lack of information. And I want to share where you can get more information. So I put my information, my contact information in this slide. That is my personal work cell. I can be reached at 909-243-9976. I provide case management, linkage to care, support group services, you name it. If there's a service that you need, if you would like to learn more about how to get HIV testing, learn more about HIV in general, have a need for community presentation regarding HIV, or maybe someone you know is positive is in need of resources, housing, food, medical care, those things I can help and give more information about through the agency that I work for, AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Also, I'm giving a link here to the San Bernardino County Ryan White service providers. And by following this link, one would find every single HIV STD service in Riverside and San Bernardino County that they may need to access. And so that's a very helpful link. I use it all the time. If you're in Riverside, there's resources for you. If you're in San Bernardino County, there's resources for you. And if you need to seek services further, you can find that through this website as well. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening to me. It was a pleasure to be here and to speak to you all. And I would like to ask if there are any questions that I may answer.
The a question here. How can someone afford the medications for HIV? Is there resources for these people?
Absolutely. That is a wonderful question. So it depends on the situation. There's a resource for everybody though, no matter your situation. If a person has private insurance, PPO, HMO, Medi-Cal, anything like that, HIV medications will be covered through the insurance. However, there are situations where people don't qualify for Medi-Cal. They don't qualify for insurance. Maybe they're undocumented, or maybe they lost a job or in between financial situations and they don't have any insurance. There is a federal grant entitled Ryan White, and there are several Ryan White service providers. My agency is one of them, where a person can apply for financial assistance and receive all of their HIV care and medications at no cost to the client. Absolutely.
Wow. Another question here is the treatment for life once you've been tested and diagnosed with HIV and you're placed on the medications? Is it for life?
The answer to this question is yes. The treatment at this time is for life. Currently, there is not a cure available to us for HIV or AIDS, and the treatment, while it is for life, it is doable. It is one pill a day in most cases. And I'm telling you, with a mindset, a right frame of mind, motivation, encouragement, and a good medical team, a person can live many, many healthy years taking their one pill a day and managing their HIV. Thank you for that. That's a good question. Any other questions?
Okay, Erica, I think those were all the questions so far, unless someone has a question out there. Again, Erica, we at Kansas Avenue just want to thank you for allowing us to be a part of this worldwide, you know, it's also like a pandemic too, you know, but we just
Yes.
thank you for sharing your knowledge, your wealth of knowledge to us here. I know you've put your information on screen. If anyone has any questions they want to take the conversation offline, they can reach you at that number. And
Yes,
if Pastor wants to put that number back up on the screen, that would be great, for our viewers who are on. There you go.
absolutely. 909-243-9976. You can reach me at my work cell anytime, text, call. I'd love to hear from you. Also, my email is erica.washington@ahf.org. I'd be happy to correspond with you via email. If there's any questions, thoughts, feedback, I'd be very happy to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you. I want to
And
say thank you, Janine, and thank you, Pastor Morris, as well. I really appreciate this opportunity.
thank you. Also, the health ministries, on the 17th of December, we have another wonderful presentation by Lori Preston Eaton. She will be discussing navigating the holidays during COVID-19. And it's at the same time, 7 o'clock. Please be there. We would be looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you.